Well, good evening. I love the subject of geology. In fact, I've been very frustrated this last year. I had 2 hips replaced last year, and fortunately there are no more. But I've not been able to get out much. And so my goal is next summer to climb Mount Washburn and Specimen Ridge next summer in Yellowstone, and I hope to be able to do that. Just right one's just a little bit painful yet, but anybody's thinking about having their hips replaced, it's well worth it. The arthritis pain is gone. So it's you sleep a lot better, I can assure you that. Okay, the Geology of Israel, something you don't hear too much about. I had the chance to go there a few years ago, and rather than go by way of tour bus, Vicki and I decided to hang out with a family. So we just drove around Israel for a couple of weeks. Just got in the car and drove wherever we wanted to see. And of course, I had a whole lot of places that I wanted to see geologically. And I knew that most of the tours really center in on the biblical places. But how many times do you ever really get to see the geology of Israel? Now, I think it's important, I say a biblical perspective, because, you know, the flood really is the most attacked part of Genesis there is. It was rejected way back in the 1700s. In fact, most of the arguments against Genesis in the 17 and 1800s were really not against the flood. The flood is just not talked about. It's not addressed. I can find no literature at all that takes the flood and addresses some of the geological questions. By the time that 1700s and 1800s came along, the vernacular was more centered on disproving Genesis, the creation, and the idea of miracles and God involved in his creation. But I can find no geologist at all that addressed anything to do with the flood. And the flood is really, I think, the pivotal point in the whole creation evolution debate. You see, if the flood was global and it took place, it was historical, global, and it did take place, then everything to do with the age of the earth is really a moot point, because all of the layers, all of the rock layers, all of the rock formations can all be explained and were all laid down by that one global flood. And so it is critical. And I made a choice years ago. I became a Christian back in 1972, and I'd been studying geology, and I made a choice at that point. I was going to see what was involved in the other side of the picture. So I know secular geology equally well as I do biblical geology, and but I've got the unique perspective of really being able to take the biblical story and apply it to the features and formations that I see all around us. And so as much as I can get outdoors and climb the various rocks and so on, boy, I love to do it, because that therein lies the key to it. So let's go ahead and get started here. Israel is really the land of limestone, and there's tons of it all over the place. Some sandstone, more limestone than anything else. Now, I'm going to be giving you a lot of information tonight. I don't expect you to go away from here memorizing it and remembering it all. What I want you to come away with, though, is the big picture, which is that biblical geology can explain every single geological formation and area around the world. That's what I want you to see tonight. It's a good explanation. Now, of course, the nation of Israel is probably the most fought-over piece of real estate in history. I don't know how many, countless wars. I'm sure there are countless wars that have been fought in Israel, and yet several places throughout the Bible. Not only is it called the land of promise, the land of Israel, but God's land. And I think there's probably somewhat of a spiritual thing going on with this chunk of land. It's not very big. It's really about the size of New Jersey. And you know, you can drive. When we landed in Tel Aviv, which is on the west coast, And we could drive to Jerusalem in just a little over an hour and a half. And there you are. And then you're almost into Jordan. So it's not very wide and really not very long, just a few hours drive, 3 to 4 hours from the top down to the southern portion of it. So it's not very big. And but it's full. I mean, it is full of geology and, of course, archaeology, too. You know, there's no place in Israel. Moshe Dayan used to say that there's no place in Israel where you can walk, where you're not walking on ancient history. And I found that to be true. When we were at some of the national parks, the pottery shards that they would find, a lot of them they couldn't use. So they just throw them out, and they'd wash down the gutters. And I picked up just a huge box of Byzantine pottery. And I picked up the Byzantine glass from the area, just a lot of stuff that you can do. And I mean, there's quite a bit of it. Anyway, in Israel, of course, the centerpiece of Israel really is Jerusalem. And there you see the part of the wall that was built in several sections. I'll show you that here in a little bit. But the wall you're looking at here was really built in the Middle Ages. And there is some new archaeological digs going on, primarily here on the eastern side of the wall and also on the northern side of the wall. You can see that's the old part of the city there. And so they are doing a lot of archaeology there, but it does take a lot of money. I was very impressed. I'd go through their national parks. Their national parks are somewhat set up like ours, with one exception. If you go there, take your own toilet paper. They do not furnish toilet paper. They make that known right off the bat. That's in their literature. You got to provide your own. Very, very expensive stuff for them. So you take your own. But anyway, the amount of work that's involved in excavating these places is just tremendous, because there's just layer after layer after layer after layer after layer, and all of its very important history. Here is a picture of the eastern wall. You can see it under the white arrow there, the eastern gate. One of the reasons one of the Islamic rulers boarded up the eastern gate was because of the prophecy that Jesus was going to come back through the eastern gate. And then they created a cemetery in front of it, believing that the Messiah would not tread over graves and sully himself. Of course, they overlooked the idea of the big earthquake that's supposed to be coming too, where the city parts and moves north and south. They didn't take that into consideration. This picture I took from the Mount of Olives, and all those boxes, you see those big boxes there? Those are all graves. And the belief is that if you can get buried on the Mount of Olives, you'll be closer to the Messiah when he returns. And of course, the prophecy is that he'll return with his feet touching the Mount of Olives. And so each one of those tombs, if you're wealthy enough to get in there, about $300,000 to get buried on the Mount of Olives. But you'll be the first to see the Messiah, you see. It's a good thing that Christians will have a different access to him, isn't it? Not this one. Okay, now here's a picture of the western wall. It's the only thing really remaining from the structure of the original old city. But the white lines represent the building periods. One on the bottom, of course, is the original. And then, of course, as it was destroyed, another one was set up. And it was destroyed, another one was set up, and then added to during Roman times. And then the Muslims came, and of course, they built up the city when they established the Dome of the Rock. One of the locations in Israel here in Apollonia, or Suf, one of the experiences you have when you're driving around Israel, you have to really be aware of the road signs. The road signs are parceled out to contractors in the particular areas. And so if the particular area has more Arabs living in it, then the name on the road sign is the Arab name, and then you have the Hebrew name, and then you have the English name. And sometimes you're just kind of looking at this, oh, do I turn here? Oh, yeah, I turn here. And you're not quite sure where things are at, but they have all these different names on the road signs. Well, this is Apollonia, or also called Arsuf. And what you're looking at there are the Crusader balls for the bombs for the catapults. And those were carved out of limestone and piled up there. And that's Apollonia is one of the most excavated cities there. Here's a real treat of mine. Israel has a lot of parks in their cities. They're beautiful parks, and they all have exercise machines, and of course they encourage fitness. And these are fancy exercise machines. They're not teeter-totters and swings. This is really good stuff, weightlifting equipment, everything in the city parks. But here's one I thought was kind of neat. This dinosaur sculpted from the bushes there. Okay, so enough of that. That's the tour through Israel here. We'll get on with the geology now. Okay, land of limestone. A biblical perspective on the geology of Israel means that we interpret the rocks and the landforms differently. One of the big deceptions that has been pushed onto Western civilization is that the rocks tell you how old the earth is. And the landforms and the geological formations in and of themselves tell you how old the earth is. That is just not true. Geologically, that's an extremely false and irritable statement. You cannot tell the age of the earth by looking at the rocks. You cannot tell the age of the earth by looking at the fossils. They do not have dates on them. You know, this hit me as a small kid. I used to go out to the Bighorn River, and we had these bluffs out there, and I would go up and down these bluffs looking for marine fossils, and I'd take my little geology book there, and all of a sudden it just hit me. How old are these fossils? I don't know how old they are. I mean, the book says one thing, but how do I know that? There are no dates on the fossils. Well, obviously, the fossils are interpreted by a particular worldview. Landforms are interpreted by a particular worldview. Rock formations, rock layers are interpreted by a particular worldview. That worldview became popular in England late 1700s, early 1800s, and of course then spread to the United States. But that is Western civilization. That is our culture. And God help you if you differ. You better not, if you're trying to get a degree in geology, do not reveal the fact that you believe in biblical geology. You won't have it for long. Now, let's take a look first, a couple of definitions. When you look at science, regardless of what can be learned from the rocks, science can only determine the observable, testable, and repeatable. So in other words, when we pick up a piece of granite, we can identify the various minerals. Now with the science of thin sections, where you can actually see the percentage of the minerals, you can also tell the percentage of the minerals in the granite. But to decide its date based upon what you're seeing is impossible. There's nothing that can give you the date. That belongs in another department down the hall in the university, in the history department or philosophy department. What we have done, though, in our Western culture is put those two together into earth science. And it is confusing, and it's baffling, and it's very misleading. History or philosophy, regardless of what can be learned from the rocks, history is the study of unique past events. Philosophy is the interpretation of those events based on one's worldview. So those are things that I know when I'm teaching geology, and I teach a lot of kids every year, probably 800 to 1,000 kids in many of my different classes. And this is the hardest thing that I have to do with kids and parents, is to help them understand the difference between science and history and philosophy. They're two different subjects. And it's good that we understand that. Earth science must be separated from Earth history. They are not the same thing. So why is this important to know? Well, limestone is a waterborne and water-laid sedimentary rock. In other words, lots of water was involved in laying down all of this limestone. The earth is covered, the surface of the earth is covered by approximately 70% of sedimentary rock, most of which is limestone. And I can take you to places. There's one particular place in Montana in the Bridger Basin, the Bridger Mountains, where the limestone vertically, one of the mountains, from down below all the way to the top, is estimated to be about 26,000 feet. That's a lot of water-laid rock. And that could not have been laid down by a river or even a springtime flood. That had to have been laid down catastrophically. Well, you go to Israel and you see the same thing as you stop by all the road cutouts. It's all limestone and sandstone, all of this stuff, all over the place. Some of it's very thick, and then some of it, of course, has worn away. Here's a very interesting feature. One of the road cutouts that we stopped at is cross-bedding in the limestone near Haifa. These are currents. These are underwater currents or underwater sand dunes, not wind-blowing. One of the ways you tell that is you drop a little bit of acid on the sandstone even, and the limestone. Of course, if it fizzes, it's not done by wind. It's done by water. And here's another up-close picture from Zion National Park, the same thing. Can you see the cross-bedding there with currents just alternating? These are underwater turbidity currents, and definitely evidence of some kind of water catastrophe. Israel is full of this place. Now, I'm going to go through a list of different limestones. Don't fall asleep during this part. Some of you may have some interest in it. I'm fascinated by it, but don't labor at trying to remember it all. I just want you to see the varieties in it. Limestone, of course, is made of calcite. Calcite is a carbonate mineral, which means that it contains calcium, carbon, and oxygen. Calcium carbonate, CaCO3. And some of the ways it shows up in Israel is in a rock called tufa, which is primarily due to hot springs. Calciolite, it's known as cement stone. These are all distinguishable sedimentary rocks. Coquina, invertebrate and vertebrate coquina. Coquina is a Spanish word. It means shell. So these are hundreds of thousands of shells all cemented together into a sedimentary rock, and it's called coquina, and that's all over Israel. Here's another picture of near Ashdod, south of Tel Aviv, along the coast. These are all fossils here. Chalk is also a big one in Israel. It's known as diatomite. If you look at chalk underneath a microscope, you'll find all kinds of specialized little creatures called diatoms. Most of you have heard of the White Cliffs of Dover, right? That's all chalk made up of billions and billions of tiny little specially created creatures called diatoms. Look at them there. I've got a picture there, a microscopic picture. They're all very specialized. They all have their own DNA structure, and all very specially created, and they're in this limestone called chalk. Here's another one, calcarenite. Is water transported larger grains. Common limestone, let me back up here. Common limestone, which is a real fine-grained material, that's the most common. Oolitic limestone is an egg stone. That's what oolite means, is egg stone. And it looks like little tiny eggs that are all cemented together. A big producer of oolitic limestone in the United States is in Indiana. Many of the old limestone buildings built around the country came from Indiana. There are limestone quarries there. And in fact, if you watch the movie Breaking Away, I don't know if any of you have seen that. It's an old movie, but it takes place in Bloomington, Indiana. And the town was divided between the cutters, those are the families that cut the old limestone, and of course the frat boys. And the whole thing centers around the Little 500, they call it. It's really quite an annual event if you get to see it. It's the bicycle version of the Indianapolis 500. And so the movie takes place, the cutters against the frat boys, and most of the shots are of the cutters, swimming in the old limestone quarries there. You can get some good pictures of those. Here's one, calcilite. It's a type of limestone made of water-transported silt-sized carbonate grains. And that's something you can distinguish all of these various things. Calcareidite type of limestone made of very large carbonate grains cemented together. And calcrete, or another word for this is hardpan, hardened layer of limestone in or on the soil. There's caliche. Now, caliche is also another Spanish word. It's a type of limestone that forms as a crust. It's a limey cement. In arid areas around the world, particularly in Israel, you'll see it. Also in Arizona, all of the volcanic rocks in Arizona all have a layer of caliche on them. And it's because the limestone that forms on the volcanic rocks. I'm not sure what the chemical reaction there is that would attract that. But by the way, it's fluorescent too. So at night you can see it. You can see it fluoresce if you have the right kind of light. The Kurkar, this is a mix of sand and limestone, essentially petrified underwater sand dunes. This is very common in the Crusader forts. They use this material a lot to make the stones and the bricks. Here's a close-up picture of one. There's a very close-up picture. You can see it. Now these were very dense, even though they had a lot of holes in them, so they withstood cannonballs. It was ready material, or not cannonballs, catapults. But ready material, they could find it anywhere without doing a lot of exploring to find it. Here's another type of limestone called dolostone. It's got the addition of magnesium in it, so it has a little bit of color to it. And then there's calcimecrite. This is a type of limestone ooze or mud. This formation you'll see a lot in Israel is called a karst. It's an irregular limestone that's really produced by the carbonic acid in the limestone. And the carbonic acid is very, very interesting. This is the reason why you have the caves in the United States. You go into these caves and you see the great big hollowed out areas with these limestone stalactites and stalagmites. And then you've got smaller tunnels and rooms and so on. Those were all carved very rapidly. Now you've got the slow dripping, but it's not the slow dripping that formed the cave. It was the amount of material that was being moved around at the end stages of the flood, and the carbonic acid would come, very strong acid at that time, would have come from a lot of the decaying billions and billions of dead creatures from the flood. And so you've got a lot of initial rapid erosion of the limestone and the sandstone due to this acid. So it's primarily dissolution, formed by dissolution mechanism, carbonic acid or carbonated water, initially from billions of decaying dead things from the flood, and you would have had a lot of them. One of the things we do on our Yellowstone trip is we go to the Lewis and Clark Caverns just outside of Yellowstone. They're really quite fantastic. You go about 600 feet underground through all these tunnels and so on. But on the hike up there to the top of the entrance, you can see fossil limestone all along the way up there, and I like to point it out to folks. Here's a picture of some limestone. We like to take the bottle of acid along. I couldn't take this on the plane, so we had to go to Haifa to get it. And we found one person that could speak English in this industrial section of Haifa, so I had a good conversation with him, and I told him what we had to do here in the United States. We got to go through Homeland Security and the FBI. By the time you get done, for a little bottle of hydrochloric acid, it's about $90. And he just said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. That's stupid." So I picked up a quart of acid for just a couple of bucks. Okay, in Israel there are 7 geological divisions in Israel, and we got to see all of these. So here they are. You have Western Galilee and Mount Carmel. Number 2, the Upper Galilee and the Golan. And we'll see pictures of all of this stuff. The Sea of Galilee and its valleys. Number 4, Tel Aviv and the Sharon Valley. And Jerusalem and its surrounding area. 6, the Central Plain and the Salt Sea. Very interesting about the Salt Sea Read through the Bible, and a lot of times they'll have it as the Dead Sea. It's not a good translation. It's the Salt Sea. It's really never referred to as the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, it's a wrong translation and a wrong reference. It's the Salt Sea, and there's a big difference. We'll talk about that. And of course, number 7 is the Negev, the big desert area. David spent a lot of time in the Negev, hiding from Saul and a lot of his enemies. Well, one of the first things you'll notice you're in northern Israel is Mount Hermon. It's actually a cluster of mountains. You can see it divides Israel and Syria. And there's a lot of skiing that goes on up there. The highest point in Israel is Mount Hermon. On the one side, it's about 7,300 feet, and the other side in Syria is about 9,200 feet. There's a lot of skiing that goes on up in Mount Hermon. And just south of Mount Hermon, there near Haifa, is the Mount Carmel, that ridge you can see circled in blue. That's a very significant ridge. A lot happened on Mount Carmel. Of course, that's where Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal. But there's something very, very interesting. When you get up on top of Mount Carmel and you look down into the valley, the whole Jezreel Valley, that's where the big Armageddon is supposed to take place. This thing is awesome. My mouth just dropped open. I've never seen such a huge valley in my life, and just stretches for miles. The Valley of Decision, the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And it is big, and you can see how there can be some big armies that would gather there. But Mount Carmel is also called God's Vineyard in Israel. It is a limestone mountain. When I was on top, I did find some fossils. There's a gastropod and sea urchin and some sponges. They're just laying all over the place up in Mount Carmel. So we challenged a few of the prophets of Baal while we were up there. Geologically, that is. And when you go a little bit further south, you run into the Sea of Galilee. Now, this is really the only freshwater source in Israel. And Israel ran through a real scare back in the 70s. It was that Syria tried to cut off the water supply to Israel. Of course, if you can cut off the water supply, where are you going to get your water? And it frightened them a lot. They're working on desalinization of the Salt Sea, and they are being very, very successful with it. So they're very in tune with the idea that there are a lot of people that just don't want them there. Now, the Sea of Galilee is also called Kinneret. It is you can see the Sea of Galilee there butted up against the Golan Heights. One thing I wanted to point out to you, see that blue arrow? That's called that surface there on the Golan Heights is called a planation surface. It's a real mystery in secular geology. The question is always, okay, what erosional force would carve the side of a mountain into ridges and other erosional features, and yet leave the top flat? And really the only explanation is the catastrophic receding floodwaters after the flood. And there are millions of these planation surfaces all over the world. In fact, if you've ever been down to Monument Valley is full of planation surfaces down there, products of the flood. But anyway, the Golan Heights were significant to Israel because Syria would put their big guns up on top. And of course, you can see the Sea of Galilee down below. They would bomb the cities on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and they would keep the traffic off the sea. Well, it's a huge source of industry for Israel. And so I believe it was in 67, Israel they'd had enough. And so that's why, if you ever wonder why they will not give the Golan Heights back, that's it. It's the only protection they have for the people near the Sea of Galilee. Here you can see it in relation to the rest of Israel there with the Golan Heights. Now, here's another picture of it. It's actually quite big. There are several towns around the Sea of Galilee, including Capernaum and Chorazin and some others, Tiberias. Now, when you go down into this area, the Sea of Galilee rests in what's called the Jordan Rift. The rift is a big crack in the earth. It's the big Jordan Valley is another word for it. And there's some interesting things about it. There's lots of basalt lava down there. Now, there are no visible volcanoes in Israel. There's some volcanic remnants up north in Israel. But you wouldn't expect to see basalt lava in Israel. I mean, this is the land of limestone, right? Where did the lava come from? Very, very interesting. When you go into the cities of Chorazin and Capernaum, they're all built of basalt lava blocks. And that's what you're looking at in this picture. That's all basalt lava. It's the stuff that you find around in Washington here. There's another picture of it. This is actually a replica of the seat of Moses. They moved the real one that was found there to a museum in Israel, but they put up a replica of it. And you can see the difference in the color of the material that makes the replica versus the basalt wall in the back. And of course, there's the explanation of it. Here are the ruins of Chorazin. They're all basalt blocks. When you get into Capernaum, is something very interesting. If you look down there on the base, the bottom of the synagogue here at Capernaum, this would have been the synagogue that Jesus spoke in. You can see the white line divides the first century. That's the basalt lava. And then later, subsequent generations rebuilt the synagogue out of limestone. So you see the two different colored rocks there. Both are abundant in this area. And I'll talk a little bit more about the rift when we get there. Here's the valley of Jezreel. You can see it a little bit clearer here. So if you're standing on the top of Mount Carmel and you're looking down into this valley, it's the most lush area in Israel. And the farms are just absolutely beautiful there. And you can see why Israel wants to protect that. During the 73 war, Syria attacked from the north and overran the Galilee. And boy, I'll tell you, that is a major source of food and exports for Israel from the valleys around Galilee. But the Jezreel Valley is huge. This is where the final Battle of Armageddon is to be fought. Mount Tabor is also located there. Mount Gilboa, of course, Mount Gilboa is famous for where Saul was killed, and Saul and Jonathan. But here is a picture of the Jezreel Valley from Mount Carmel. I mean, it just stretches for as long as you can see, for as far as the eye can see, and beautiful, beautiful farms. There's Mount Tabor. It looks like a volcano, but it's not. It's just an erosional remnant, probably left over from the flood. Here's a picture of Mount Gilboa, also an erosional remnant. And then that mountain range overlooks the Jezreel Valley. You can see it just on the other side. Okay, to the Jordan Rift now, here it is. It's a big long crack in the earth. It's called the Jordan Rift Valley, and there you can see it again. It stretches all the way through Israel, all the way around to Africa. Those sand dunes you see in the center, those are petrified underwater sand dunes from turbidity currents. But here's another picture from the air. There's the crack that forms the valley that contains the Salt Sea and the Jordan Rift Valley. Stretches for 4,000 miles. So it's big. Now, how would you explain that big of a rift? Of course, they try to explain it through plate tectonics, but it's never been, excuse me, plate tectonics has never been proven and never been seen to be happening. So actually, the flood, I think, has a better explanation for it. If you think of Genesis 7:11, if you just read that a few times, In the 600th year of Noah's life, the fountains of the great deep burst open. This would have been one of those huge cracks, and that's why it's the lowest spot on earth, is down there where the Salt Sea is. Here's a kind of a relief map. You can see Jerusalem's there at the top. Then you can see how far down the Jordan Rift goes, down into the Salt Sea. It's about 4,200 feet below sea level, the lowest place on earth. This is part of the crack. And it's at the top of that crack is where all of that lava shows up. And this would have been, of course, a huge volcanic event. The fountains of the great deep burst open. I think it explains a lot of the cracks we have around the earth. And then you can see how the flood would have washed off a lot of stuff into the coastal areas of Israel and, of course, left the remnants there. There's Jerusalem. By the way, too, the drive from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem is absolutely magnificent. There is a code, a city code, that if you build there, you have to build out of the natural limestone of the area. So all of the city takes on, especially with the sun shining on the limestone blocks, the city takes on this almost like the city of gold, you know, as you're driving up to Jerusalem. And all those psalms you see in the Song of Ascents, and you can imagine the pilgrims as they're going up to Jerusalem. That's what they're doing. They're going up to Jerusalem and up to this gorgeous city that sits on what they call 7 hills or 7 mountains. Absolutely gorgeous drive if you get a chance to do it. And there's the Jordan Valley and the runoff from the flood, is the way I see it. The uniformitarian explanation. Now, uniformitarian is the standard view of geology today. It was really incorporated into geology in the beginning in about the late 1700s, but really took over all of geology and evolutionary biology in the 1800s. And it just simply totally erased any thought of God being in the picture. Put on these blinders and said, what we can see in the present is sufficient to explain the past. Well, that just rules out everything you read in the Old Testament. That would rule out miracles, because you don't see many miracles today. It's not that you deny that they happen, but I've never seen Lazarus raised from the dead. You know, I've never seen a lot of the big miracles that took place, the parting of the Jordan, or the Jordan River for the Levite priests to go through, and the Red Sea, and so on. So because we don't observe these miracles today, they're ruled out. And, of course, in the process, they rule out the history of Israel, too. Now, the uniformitarian explanation for this area is, as the plates of the earth moved apart over millions of years, the 2 continents began to separate, creating a crack. Well, once you introduce the flood, though, to the whole picture, that changes everything. Excuse me, just a minute here. A good way to remember uniformitarianism is this way. Small and slow and long ago. It's a good way to remember it. I learned this from Gary Parker years ago. It's a good way to remember it. The catastrophist explanation is really Genesis 7:11. All the fountains of the great deep burst open, leaving the remnants of cracks all over the earth. Now, a good way to remember this, excuse me, big and fast and in the recent past. You see that those 2 ideas are just so contradictory, and neither one can be proven by science. They're worldviews. And you take the one worldview it's really the minority worldview, and you put it up against the big giants that have all the money and the universities and everything. Excuse me, it really is quite intimidating. But that's, of course, what believers are called to, isn't it? To believe God in spite of what comes out of the world. Now, here's a good basic biblical interpretive framework that I use. You can use it for anywhere you go, Israel, wherever you go. Of course, the Bible really teaches that there's about 6,000 years of biblical history, beginning with the creation. It was a recent creation, six-day creation, and then a pre-flood world that lasted about 1,600 years, and then a flood that lasted more than a year, about a year and a half. And then we live in a period now right after the flood called the post-flood period. This helps me keep those events together. And so we don't have this flood idea way out here. And, okay, why do we experience glacial melting today? And why do we experience earthquakes and things like that? Well, it's because we're living in the post-flood world. And that really does explain a lot. But take that little biblical interpretive framework and use it as a template wherever you go. Doesn't matter. You can go use this in whatever U.S. park you're in or whatever area of the world you're in. Now, this sea down there is called by most people the Dead Sea. And I'm not sure how it got its name other than the fact that it's the saltiest body of water on earth. People may have called it the Dead Sea, and that's the way we refer to it today. But in the Bible, it's really never referred to. If you look at the original language, it's never referred to as the Dead Sea. It's always the Salt Sea. Because it really geologically is not correct to call it the Dead Sea. There are a lot of critters living in that thing. A lot of life. And life that God originally created lives in that body of water. The resorts along the area, too, I was surprised at, and I'll talk about that in a little bit here. But anyway, they refer to this body of water there in Israel as the Salt Sea in the Scripture. Here's what the shoreline looks like. It's not very pretty, is it? And the salt, just, you could take a little twig and leave it down there on the beach right there along the lake, and within a matter of minutes, I mean, it is covered in salt. It's really quite interesting. But here's what surprised me. The place stinks, and it isn't very attractive, but notice what you have all around the Salt Sea. Look at this. These are resorts. What? Resorts all around the Salt Sea. Now, why would that be? Well, because the Salt Sea has about 21 different nutrients in it that actually help with many skin diseases and ailments. So people come from all over the world to sit in the Salt Sea to take advantage of the minerals in the Salt Sea and the mud baths and so on there. It's a real, despite the way it looks, it's a real healthy place. I was just totally shocked when I saw it. I just figured it'd be this abandoned place, but a lot of resorts, fancy resorts around the Salt Sea. One of the areas I enjoyed seeing was in the northern part of Israel called Caesarea. As you drive along the coast there, you'll see all kinds of limestone and sandstone with cross bedding and folded. Now, it always used to puzzle me when I would look at folded rocks as a geologist, wondering, how do rocks bend? I mean, if you take a rock, if you can get enough pressure on it and apply the pressure here, you won't bend it. You'll break it. It'll snap. So it tells me that rock must have been moist and pliable at one time and was bent when it was in that state. And then after that, then hardened into the features that we see. So that's a very clear illustration there. And that's sedimentary rock there. Lavas, of course, they bend all over the place and then they solidify. But the principle is still the same. It had to have been fluid at one point in its history. As you get into Caesarea, it was the favorite place built by Herod for the emperors. It was kind of like Palm Springs. It's where they went for a rest. And it really is quite a place. They're really doing a lot of excavation there. But there is no granite in Israel. So here you have a granite column. And so the Romans must have imported a lot of their materials. The same way here with marble. There are a lot of marble columns there in Caesarea, and that was also must have been imported from somewhere because these are not natural to the area. What you do find a lot of are the Kirkar columns. You see that material there. They used a lot of that. And that's up near, on the way to Haifa. And that is one place you don't want to miss. It's got a lot of Crusader history as well as early Roman history in that area. Now, my favorite area, I think, of Israel has to be the Negev. This is the most interesting to me. The desert just fascinates me. Now, this is where my wife and I, this is the only real difference we have with one another, and she will not watch one of my favorite movies is The Desert Fox, the Rommel. She refuses to watch that movie with me. She hates deserts and desert movies. So I have to watch that one alone. But I love the Negev, and she did go in there with me. And there's just a lot of history there, and there's a lot of geology in the Negev. This is the area, this is what they consider to be the Negev. And it was actually Ben Gurion's favorite place. His place of residence is in the Negev. Yes? Most of it, yeah. Yeah, Lawrence of Arabia. Another desert movie she refused to watch. But this was Ben Gurion's favorite place, and he really felt like of all the places in Israel, this was the place that needed to be defended. And I'm sure he was struck by all of the history. I mean, most of Israel's history is centered in the Negev that took place there. And it's actually very, very majestic. And of course, the Negev includes the fortress of Masada, which was this was an architectural masterpiece in and of itself. It's located right on the other side of the Salt Sea. And Herod actually built it because he was afraid of the Jews. Herod wasn't exactly Jewish. He was Idumean, which is, they were, in some ways, they were kind of half-breeds. But Augustus Caesar put him in charge of Israel. He and Augustus Caesar were very, very good friends. And Israel hated him, but in order to win their friendship, Herod rebuilt the temple that Ezra had constructed and added to it and beautified it and so on. But he was still afraid of the Jews. So he built several fortresses around Israel that he could escape to if things got out of hand. And one of them was Masada. And we'll look at that here in a little bit. Here is a good picture of the Negev. This is classic Negev desert. And you can see the planation surfaces, just deposits after deposits of limestone and sand. And there were the family that we were with. We're all looking for fossils throughout that area. Found tons of fossils in the area. Masada is a Greek word. It does mean fortress. One of the three great fortresses built by Herod. And you can see the layout of it. Here is a picture of it up at the top. And there's the Roman ramp there to the right. Also an architectural masterpiece. How they got that up there and were able to move siege machines up that ramp is just incredible how they did it. But the Masada was virtually unconquerable. They had their own water supplies, unlimited water supplies on Masada. In fact, when we were there, we saw the big baths that were cut out of the limestone there and the sandstone, and just unlimited supply of water. They could have stayed up there for ages, but then the Romans, after a while, of course, built the ramp, and the story is they took it, they conquered it. If you're up on top of Masada, you can look down into the desert, and you see that square there down on the right? That's actually the works, the fence lines of the Roman encampments, still there. And they're all over Masada. You can see them as you get up on top, you look down, you can see what were the Roman encampments. The stones and stuff are still there. One of my favorite places in the Negev desert is actually when you start going south. Of course, you see all kinds of planation surfaces, receding flood remnants. There's a big one there. One of my favorite areas is called the Makkesh Ramon. This is actually another name for it in Israel, is the Grand Canyon of Israel. And it's a huge canyon. I mean, it is big. It's several miles across, and you can see just how deep it is too. See those black areas, those discolored areas? Those are actually volcanic remnants. And we got to go down there and walk around them, and I found all kinds of neat geological samples. Black areas are volcanic remnants reflecting volcanism of the flood period. Here's another picture. You can actually see a remnant of a volcano there in the foreground of the picture behind. You can see it up there in the top. Get a little bit of an idea of the depth of this canyon. There we are at the side of the road. You can see the depth of this canyon. It's big, it's massive. And then, of course, it's loaded with mountain goats, too. Anyway, just a neat area. I really enjoyed this. I wanted to stay a lot longer. One of the places we stayed in the Negev, they don't have, hotels down in there. And we were coming in on Friday, which, of course, is the beginning of the Sabbath. And nothing is open Friday afternoon through Saturday. And, of course, it's one thing we'd just forgotten about. So forget supper. I mean, the place we were staying at didn't even serve supper. And but we stayed at a camel ranch, which is appropriate out in the Negev. The Negev, by the way, was the only place in those 2 weeks we were there that got rain. And we were climbing up in the mountains surrounding this camel ranch, and I picked up a lot of mountain snails. I thought, well, these would be kind of just interesting to bring home. So when I got them home, I began to wash them and clean them a bit and laid them out on a piece of cloth to dry, and some of them began to move. I just looked at that and I said, that's pretty incredible. So I did a lot of research on them. They're mountain snails, and they have a 7-year dormant period. And when they get wet from rain or water, they move around. They kind of wake up. And that was one of the highlights of my trip, was to see the snails that I thought were just hollow mountain snails actually wake up. Here's one of the volcanic remnants in the Negev. This is actually what we call a laccolith. A laccolith means a pond stone. That's what the word means. And a laccolith is this volcanic, it's actually a type of volcano, but never really quite erupted. At one point, there was lots of sediments that were buried over it, and as the volcano began to push up, it ponded into a feature that looks like a volcano, never quite erupted through the sediments. And then as the receding floodwaters flowed off of the earth, a lot of these remnants then were exposed. And you see these quite often through the Colorado Plateau. There's a great big one outside of Moab, Utah, great big laccolith. It's just sitting right in between these huge walls of sandstone. And, of course, the sandstone walls are higher than the laccolith, but very interesting features, all volcanic, never quite erupted. Here's a laccolith in Monument Valley. Do you see these volcanic necks? I'm sure you've seen these in pictures and so on. Yeah, these are laccoliths. So volcanoes that never quite erupted. And geologists know this, and it's a mystery to them. Where did all the sediments go that covered them? Well, it catastrophically had to be washed away. These are huge. These are over 1,000 feet high. And, of course, over 1,000 feet across. Huge volcanic remnants that just never quite erupted as volcanoes, but were covered by sedimentary layers. And these are all over the place down in the Colorado Plateau. Another interesting feature in the Negev is this place called a carpentry shop. This is actually metamorphosed sandstone. And it's actually very interesting formations. These are all blocks of sandstone that have been metamorphosed, so they're partially turned into quartzite. Not all the way, but partially turned into quartzite. And again, you have to have a lot of heat for that, and you have to have a lot of water, and of course you have to have some pressure. So this is a very interesting feature to go see this. One of the folks in the family took a big risk. They said, you know what, we're not supposed to take stuff from here. But they did. They grabbed me a block of this stuff and brought it home when they came back to the United States. So I have I have a piece of contraband in my museum from the carpentry shop. I didn't take it. Very interesting place. So if you go to Israel, going to the Negev, here's a basalt column in the Negev. And notice what's overlying the basalt lava. So this would indicate the events. You had the eruption, fountains of the great deep bursting open, which would have been where a lot of the lava would have come from. Those are basalt columns. And then you have the limestone over the top, which should have been the sedimentary recessional stage of the flood. Here's another picture of the volcanoes in that area. All volcanic rock. And another picture. Also within this same area, this is an amazing feature. It's called the Ammonite Wall. Ammonites are cephalopods. They're like the modern-day nautilus. Now, if you can see the hand there on the right side of the picture, notice the hand for comparison. Those are huge, huge ammonites. These are marine creatures. And notice the graveyard effect. I mean, there's just a massive burial of these things. And that, of course, would have been laid down during the recessional stage of the flood through some of the deposits. This is another part of the Ammonite Wall. Only a significant catastrophic event like the flood could explain this much fossilization. Another very interesting formation as you go south in the Negev are limestone layers, limestone and sandstone layers, you'll see them. But you'll see what we call dikes. These are vertical pieces of sedimentary rock that run right up through the layers. All of this had to be done simultaneously. There's no way a dike can push up through this hardened rock. It all had to have been formed quite rapidly, quite simultaneously. The uniformity of the layers on the dike would have to have been formed in the same event with no long periods of time in between the layers. Now, here's a question I get asked a lot about Israel. Did the great ice event after the flood have any impact on Israel? I've begun calling this period of time, I'm calling it an ice age, but I've been reverting to the name that was given to it when it was first named as an ice event. It was originally coined by Louis Agassiz in the 1800s. He's recognized as the father of modern glaciology. And he came from Switzerland. So when you study glaciology, I tell my kids, I said, if you're going to go into geology now, you got to learn all kinds of languages. You have to learn Greek, you have to learn Latin, you have to learn some German. And when you study the glaciers, you have to learn French. Because the guy who gave us glaciology spoke French. And his name was Louis Agassiz. And in 1837, he was the first to propose scientifically that the Earth had been subject to a past ice event. Even the biblicists of this time felt like all of the surface remnants that we saw were due to the flood. So that anything, it was all lumped together. Things like glacial cirques, these rounded valleys you see, the French word, and the mountains like the Matterhorn were all supposedly sculpted by the flood. Well, Louis Agassiz kind of put the death knell to that by showing this is very much like what he observed in Europe. And so in order of the events, you've got creation, you've got the filling portion of the flood, you've got the recessional stage of the flood, and then, because of all the volcanic eruptions, you've got a huge ice event. And that really forms most of the deposits that you see on top of a lot of the sedimentary stuff. And his term for it was an ice event. Never called it an ice age. That was added later, especially as evolutionary ideas began to come in. Now, I like to point this out. He was also a polygenist. He believed in polygenism, where races came from separate creations. A lot of the geologists and scientists did believe that. This is one of the reasons they had the racist attitudes that they did in the 1800s, that somehow the European races were the favored races. And so you have the individual races. And that, of course, is just totally unbiblical, and we just don't look at it the same way. If you look at the evidence of an ice event, And you can see from the evidence, this was kind of the extent of this major ice event. You can see lots of Europe was covered, lots of America was covered. This is one of the reasons we have the San Juan Islands out here. They were all land at one point. And when the glaciers began to really melt, then you've got all the land portions carved up, and you've got the beautiful San Juan Islands. They're glacial remnants, is what they are. Well, it's very interesting. After the ice began to recede, melt, of course, it raised the sea levels. Below the water levels, in the red here, if you can look real closely, you'll see the red areas? If you can just look real closely. That's the land that had existed prior to the ice event. Now, as the glaciers began to melt and the water levels began to raise, it buried a lot of the civilizations. Actually, it's probably too big of a word for it. A lot of the settlements, we'll call them, that had been settled from after the Tower of Babel. And so a lot of these things just went underwater, and cultures moved back inland. But you can see the amount of land that was inundated by more flooding from the ice event. It's a very significant part. Not many Bible students study the ice event. Tell you a funny story here. I used to teach Christian high school, and excuse me, I was almost fired. One of my jobs was, excuse me, some of you have asthma, kicks up during this time. It just makes it raises its ugly head during this fall time for me. But anyway, one of my jobs was to teach the Bible to freshmen through senior. They had to go through every verse of the Bible by the time they graduated. And so I get the smart aleck freshmen that come in, the first year, and we start in Genesis. And they pepper you with questions, They're way ahead of you. And so it's, Mr. Nurre, okay, how come the Ice Age is never mentioned in the Bible? So we go in, we try to fit it into the Bible, we work it in and see where it could fit. And probably just wasn't that important of an event to record. Everything was happening south of the glacial fields. Well, anyway, all the kids go home excited, that piece of the puzzle got put together. And that night, the principal got flooded with phone calls. And he came in the next morning and he said, I've had a lot of phone calls demanding that I fire you. And for what? They said, because you're teaching evolutionary ideas. And I thought right then, okay, this is really reflective, I think, of the ignorance in the church with this period of time, this ice event. It's there. The evidence is there. I've seen tons of it. I've got lots of stuff I've collected from the big ice event. So where do you fit it? That's the big question is not, did it take place? The big question is, where does it fit within the scriptures? And that you have to work it out. If you don't work it out, then you get into this denial thing where you put on the blinders and you kind of ignore it. But it's a very significant part of Earth history and really was as a result of the flood. Of course, not all of the Middle East and Israel would have been desert immediately after the flood. There would have been a lot of green and lush valleys in Israel. You read through the Old Testament, and what do you see about Sodom and Gomorrah? Was it a desert place? No, it's why Lot went there. It was green, it was lush, it was very attractive. And there are parts all over the world like this. Even in Saudi Arabia, there are examples of civilization in what is now the desert, right in the middle. It wasn't always desert. There was a time shortly after the flood for quite a long time when it was a very lush and green and wet climate throughout most of the world, while parts of the world were under ice. So the geography, of course, significantly changed after the flood. And initially the desert regions were more green and lush. I think a lot of what we see in Israel today has been really denuded because of the wars. A lot of the battles that took place, what did they do when they go in? They chop down all the trees and use them for siege machines. And it's, war after war after war after war. Just just cleaned the area out. When Mark Twain visited the area, he just could not figure out why God had created Israel. To him, it was the armpit of the world. And, the bodies of water in Israel were all were marshes filled with malaria. And in the 1800s, Israel began to buy chunks of land from the Turks. They had control of that area. They didn't care about it. They began to sell these chunks of land to Israel, and they went and they cleared out the marshes and then created what is now a very beautiful land. I mean, it is quite something. Mark Twain would not have recognized it if he'd visited today. But anyway, that's the geology of Israel in a nutshell. If you want to know more, I do have a kit on the geology of Israel. It's filled with rocks and minerals I brought back. I shipped them all back. And fortunately, it was all in shekels, so I didn't see the bottom line. But I shipped tons of stuff back home, so I put it in all these kits. And all my write-up on the geology of Israel is in this kit. And if you want to have that, you can see me or my wife, Vicki, back there, and she can tell you how to order it. It's a full-color 99-page loose-leaf book, so it really has a lot of research, far more than what we covered today. And also, too, I do have a museum in the Linwood area. If you want to see more of that, you can go on my website, northwestrockandfossil.com, Northwest Treasures. And I have a geology learning center there as well as a store. And I'm getting ready now to construct my latest display on the hominid fossils. So I've got 15 or so reproductions of the various skulls. And a very, very interesting display. But anyway, that's there. We also have a reproduction of the Lucy skeleton. We have a T-Rex skull. We have a life-size dinosaur in there, and we got tons of fossils and minerals and rocks. So we get a lot of kids in there, a lot of families. So again, you can see the price for attending online and see some of the other things we do offer. To date, I've published 17 textbooks for kids, pre-K up through high school on the subject of geology. My goal is to make every kid I see a geologist, and not necessarily a college grad, but one who knows how to interpret the geology of the earth by way of the Bible. So, Chris?
Thank you much, Patrick. You guys give Patrick thanks. We're going to take up a quick offering, and then we do have time for a couple of questions. We're running a bit late, but Lynn, would you mind helping Shane there a bit? We're responsible for our speaker honorariums personally. Hold on just a second. Let me give us a prayer first. So help us as much as you can. We do our best to have about half of our speakers being from out of town. You might remember this summer we had John Bile come down from Canada. We also had Thomas Kendall come up from Southern Oregon. And so we do have some considerable expenses to try to have these speakers come in for you every month. So help us as much as you can. Make checks payable out to Cedar Park Church. All of this money gets turned over directly to them and put in a special account for this program. And don't forget this Seattle Creation Conference coming up in a couple of weeks. Let me just offer us up a prayer for the offering. Father, we thank you so much for Patrick and the word that he brought today. And again, we just ask for your blessings upon him, Father. We also ask for your blessings upon Cedar Park Church and the tremendous ministries that are ongoing here, the Christian school, the various facets of this tremendous cathedral ministry, Father. We just ask for your blessings truly upon this ministry, Father. And we just ask that this offering is used to further your kingdom. In Christ's name, amen. So we don't have much time, and I understand that if we have kids need to be picked up at 8 o'clock, we're running really close to that. If you need to pick up your kids, by all means, won't be offended if we see you get up and leave. So, but we'd be... For those that have driven, we want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, all right? So even though we're running a bit close to overtime here, I'm going to go ahead and allow a few questions, okay? Hope that's okay with everyone. So just raise up your hand. I'll bring the microphone around right here.
My question is about not so much just localized to Israel, but geology in general. It seemed to indicate in the Bible that before the flood, that there was more land than there was water. And is there any part of the earth that geologists have thought that might still be the pre-flood part of the earth, still in existence?
Yeah, there's, of course, the debate's always ongoing about that because we're trying to sort out all this stuff on Pangea and Gondwana and all this kind of stuff, you know. But there are these huge areas on every continent in the world. Every continent of the world has one. They're called cratons. And geologists refer to them as the original part of the Earth's crust. That is way, 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 way back, even before Pangea. A part of the original Earth's crust. They're exposed on every continent. One of the big questions is those cratons don't move. They are solidly hooked into the Earth. And geologists recognize they don't move. And so if they don't move, how can you have the continents moving around? And so when we look at the cratons, they consist of what we call basement rock or the plutonic rock, which would be rocks like granite, gabbro, and so on, and also metamorphic rock. So I think mixed in with those are probably part of the original created Earth. What we see going on today is 70% of the Earth is covered. Miles of thickness of sedimentary rock. If we could get down underneath that, we might just run into some of the crust. Now, there are places on the Earth which we do think are related to basement rocks, and that is, one of those places is Yosemite, where the granite has been pushed up and then eroded by glaciers. But that would be a good area for basement rock or original created crust. Another one are the Beartooth Mountains. Beartooth Mountains would contain a lot of what would be referred to as original crustal Earth. So it's here and there all over the world. But the flood, when you start thinking about the flood, I used to, when I was a kid, I used to play in a bathtub. My goal was to, had this little model of the ark, you know, had, 5 animals on it, and Noah and Mrs. Noah. And my goal was to sink it. So I'd get going back and forth in the bathtub and try to capsize the stupid thing. You know, that's what I thought about Noah's Ark during that. And of course, I grew up with that myth that it was just a story. But when you think of Noah's flood as a geological event, my goodness, and just close your eyes and imagine this huge crustal cracks breaking open and lava flowing every which way and hot water spewing up and killing people and animals and everything. It was a catastrophic event. So very little of God's original creation really remains. I ruin people's vacation when we go on tours in Yellowstone because I like to point out to them, they're awestruck by the mountains. And they go, wow, what is God's creation? I say, well, actually, what you're looking at is really the result of sin. You know, yes, it bears resemblance, but just a tiny bit of resemblance to God's original creation. Most of it's been marred and destroyed by man's sin. So, but there are areas like that are still exposed.
You had mentioned earlier that it's hard to tell time from rocks. So how would you answer someone with their belief in carbon-14 dating?
Well, let's see. How much time do we have, Chris? Essentially, let me put the chronology in place first. This is important to see. An old Earth was decided on before radioactivity was even invented. Radioactivity was invented in 1897. The old Earth, an old Earth was decided on in the early 1800s. These guys who originally set the foundation of modern geology had already decided that the Bible's chronology was wrong and that the Earth must be older than what the Bible says. James Hutton, called the father of modern geology, he thought the Earth was older than the Bible because it looked older. I mean, that was his scientific, idea. Real scientific, isn't it? So then 1897 comes along, radioactivity is discovered, and somebody in the 1900s gets the idea that perhaps by measuring current radioactive decay rates, we can make it work like a clock. In other words, if we take what we observe today and project it into the past, we can tell you how old this rock is by the ratio we see today of parent rock that's radioactive and a non-radioactive rock mineral or rock called or element called the daughter element. Now, can any of you think of what principle they just applied or I just applied at that point? What principle did you learn from this seminar tonight that I just applied to that process? Can you think about it? Exactly, uniformitarianism. Radioactivity was discovered in 1897. How long have we observed radioactive decay rates? Not very long. What could have affected radioactive decay rates in the past? Any idea? The flood. The flood would have generated all kinds of heat and processes that would have affected all of radioactivity. In fact, it's my opinion that a lot of the radioactivity we observe today was really released during the flood. When you take a look at the earth, as revealed in Genesis, from the earth we have now, it's a totally different place. And a lot of the radioactivity we have today is, I mean, it's downright dangerous. And I just can't see God making a good earth with radioactivity busting out all over the place. It just doesn't fit with my worldview. So it's really the principle of uniformitarianism that's applied to what we can observe now and projected into the past, and assumptions are made and conclusions are drawn. Therefore, the earth is 4.6 billion years old. Well, if you think about, for instance, take the half-life of uranium-238. Now, it's kind of interesting. It's 4.5 billion years for the half-life of uranium. If no one was around that long, how do they know that? The only way they can guess at it is if they take the present rate of decay and assume it remained constant for the endless ages. And that's what they do. That is a very dangerous assumption to make, and it fools around with your eternity. I'm not willing to gamble with my eternity on that big of a guess. I'd rather believe the scripture and then conclude that geologists have made a huge mistake because of the assumptions that they've made. Yeah.
You mentioned the volcanic events leading to or being connected to the ice event that you referred to. So I was just wondering how you connected those two, or what the connection may be between volcanism and ice event.
Oh, yeah, very good question. When we go on our Yellowstone trip, one thing that we observe is Yellowstone, of course, is a huge caldera, probably the biggest caldera eruption. The crater of the caldera is 45 miles across, 35 miles wide. And if it went off today, it would obliterate about 250 square miles around its area, which would have meant a lot of big cities in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming would be just obliterated. And so they're all volcanic eruptions that were taking place during the Great Ice Event and after for a while. You can measure these with some in recorded history. They're tapering off in terms of big eruptions and frequency. They're tapering off. And so some of the big ones, you know, we've never seen a caldera eruption today, like Yellowstone. Crater Lake is another great big one. The Mammoth Lakes area in California, east of Yosemite, is another one. They're all active, but there's nothing that's really happened with them in the last several years. So those spewing up as much volcanic ash into the atmosphere would have created a sort of nuclear winter, would have blocked out the sun's reflective rays and cooled an atmosphere. The warmer oceans, due to the magma coming up from the flood, would have heated the oceans to several degrees at least, and would have increased evaporation. Increased evaporation to a cooler atmosphere, that's a perfect recipe for lots and lots and lots of snow, which of course accumulates and forms glaciers.
So Job 37:10 is the only verse I know that kind of looks at the possibility of an ice age. Where do you find verses that'll...
In fact, the one in Job, I think, is what Job is observing. Whether he was observing the parts of the big ice sheets or not, I have no idea. But if you notice in Genesis, most of civilization centers around what was going on below the ice sheets. And some of the hominids that we find are actually men. Call them hominids because evolutionists anthropology divides the evolution of man into two groups. You have the Australopithecines, which are the apes, ape-like creatures, and the hominids, which are the man-like creatures. So ape and man, extinct apes and men who've been fossilized. And so as you're looking at that, you find the Neanderthals happened to wander up north, so did the Cro-Magnons and others, the Heidelbergs and so on. They migrated into the north, I am guessing, to escape maybe a lot of the brutality that happened after the Tower of Babel. People are going to blame one another for that event. The guys think they're the elite. They're going to look at people they think are inferior. These people are going to try to escape. And so I think that's why you find them up around the ice sheets. That's where most of the evidence is close to the ice sheets. Most of civilization was developing down into the warmer areas below the ice sheets. And so I really think it's very soon in Genesis, obviously, that God focuses in on Israel. And I just don't think the ice event was a big enough deal. I mean, that's my opinion, to really include in there. So I have to fit that in there because the biblical history is true. There wasn't an alternate history. And so the only way it makes sense to me is a post-flood ice event. But no verses. I can't think of any verses on it.
Thank you, Patrick. We appreciate you. So there's Patrick's website again. Northwest Rock and Fossil, is that still the current domain?
Yeah, northwestrockandfossil.com.
So you can go to his website and look up where his Geology Learning Center is and maybe consider a visit there, or the upcoming find some information on the upcoming Yellowstone field trip this summer. Stop by the table back there if you want to sign up for our email list. Don't forget that the Seattle Creation Conference coming up here a week from Friday and Saturday. That's Friday night, 2 seminars Friday night, 6 Saturday, bunch of brochures on the table on your way back, on your way out. There's still coffee. I always forget to remind people when they arrive that there's coffee, but we always have coffee back there in the corner, and they yell at me if we leave a lot of leftovers. So stop back, get a cup on your way out if you want. Check the book tables. We'll see you. So I'm teaching next week, and it may either be in the origin of life or Old Testament archaeology. I haven't really decided yet, but it'll be awesome one way or the other. Patrick, would you close out in a word of prayer?
Yeah, sure will. Sure. Let's do that. Lord, we do thank you for tonight, and we thank you just for a little bit more exposure to the reality and historicity of your words. And it always encourages me as I see that you have really acted all throughout history. You've been there all throughout history. You've been there for us. You've been there for all people. You've been kind of the guiding light. Even though man has ignored you, you've been there. And we thank you that you've left us with a good historical framework to interpret all of Earth history. And we pray, Lord, we become good stewards. Amen.